Hey, this time we are going to be talking about loanable funds, which is another thing that people ask to get some information about. This may very well be related to an aggregate supply, aggregate demand question. And again, you are not graphing, but understanding the graph can help you to answer the questions, right? Because they may be asking you something that normally they would ask you to graph, but now they're telling you, tell me what happens to this curve, which direction does it shift, something along those lines. So let's start by just a generic loanable funds graph. What does it look like? Down here, we just have quantity of loanable funds. Let's face it, if you write, QLF, that's fine because who cares? Nobody's seeing your graph, right? But understanding what the different variables are helps to understand the graph better. And up top, you have real interest rate. Again, they're not really going to ask you specifically real interest rate. If anything, they probably are even telling you in the question whether it's real or whether it's nominal, and that maybe is a cue, whether you're using loanable funds market or money market. Again, even that, more often than not, they're going to tell you which graph they want you looking at. Unlike money market, where the supply of money is fixed, the supply of loanable funds is not. And so we're going to have an upward sloping supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve, and then this is going to dictate your quantity of loanable funds and your real interest rate. Okay. Now, this is often referred to when dealing with the aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and dealing with government policy, right? So if the government wants to incentivize savings, if they want to encourage spending, what are they going to do to loanable funds in order to make that happen? Or what policy would they do that would make it happen in loanable funds? So let's say that the government is creating a policy that is encouraging people to save money. All right. First off, you want to understand that savings goes with supply. And I would not actually label it as such, but just for understanding, it can't hurt. And that your spending or your borrowing is going with the demand curve, right? Which makes sense. The demand for loans is because you're borrowing a loan and you're spending money. Okay. So sort of think about it in those terms. So let's say again, like I mentioned, that the government is trying to encourage people to save their money, which is important because the more money that people save, the more loans are available for people to then take out, which means that businesses and individuals can invest their money. Ooh, this is also investment as well. So individuals and businesses can invest their money. And so really what this means is that savings allows for long run economic growth, which is very likely a question that they will ask. Because again, if you save more, let's take a look at what happens actually. So if savings increase, and we'll talk about how the government can encourage this in a second, what's that going to do? Oh, look, the quantity of loanable funds that people are willing to take out increases because look what happened to your interest rates. When interest rates are lower, the quantity that people are willing to borrow goes up, and then those people can spend that money and it increases not only aggregate demand, but also aggregate supply. Now, how can the government encourage people to save their money? One policy that they might implement is to tax less on your interest earnings. So if the government is saying, we're not going to take as much out of the money that you earn when you put your money in the bank, people are like, oh, hell yeah, I'm going to go put my money in the bank. And so it increases the supply of loanable funds. This is one option, right? Now, earthquake. There are other things that can happen with your loanable funds. And one of them could be that rather than encouraging savings, and typically the government encourages savings when your economy is either doing well or you're heading into like an inflationary period. But let's say instead that your economy is heading into a recession. And so the government is going to try and implement policy to encourage people to actually spend their money. Okay, and so what that would do is encourage people to take out loans all right, which would alter the demand. So what kind of a policy would the government do for that? They may give you some kind of like a tax credit for doing such and such. So like in the 2008 recession, I bought a house because I was going to get an $8,000 tax credit back from the government. So I was like, hey, this is a great time. I'm a new home buyer. Sounds awesome. There was also the cash for clunkers deal, where if you went and you bought a new, more fuel efficient car and you traded in your old yucky car, you would get a $2,000 tax credit. So the government can sometimes actually use tax rebates or deductions or credits in order to encourage people to borrow money, whether it be to buy a house, to buy a car, whatever. And so that's going to increase the quantity of loanable funds being taken out. Although, how does that impact interest rates down the line? It's going to raise interest rates at least, sometime down the line. And the whole point is people don't care so much about the interest rate. They just care about the tax credit that they're getting back. And so they're willing to deal with a slightly higher interest rate because of this change. Okay. And so again, loanable funds can impact aggregate supply, aggregate demand, because if the demand for loans is up, that means aggregate demand increases, and that can increase your GDP or your real output. Now, what we also have to consider with loanable funds is the potential for government spending. So rather than like tax credits, like the other two situations, really looking at what happens when the government goes and spends money. And I'm going to draw two graphs in this situation because there's two options to graph what happens when the government is going to borrow cash. All right. And I'm sure you all know what I'm getting at, which is going to be the situation of crowding out. Okay. Ooh, here's some ugly graphs. Okay. One situation, or one way of showing the same situation of crowding out, is by shifting the supply curve. That's the way that I tend to like better. I think it makes a little more sense when looking at what happens to your interest rate and your quantity. So again, going back to what would end up being the second question on the AP, where you're altering aggregate supply, aggregate demand, they're trying to close an economic gap of some sort, and the government needs to borrow money in order to spend money, okay? When they borrow money, what they're literally doing is they're taking money out of supply, right? And so your supply curve shifts to the left, which causes real interest rate to rise, and the quantity of loanable funds available for everybody else to decrease. That's why I tend to like this graph better, because it shows you exactly what happens to not just interest, but also to the quantity of loanable funds available for the rest of society. Now, the other option, and both, are fine. And so obviously, again, you're not graphing, but describing either one will work out just fine. But this is why you really want to pay attention to what happens to these two variables. Because if the government's borrowing money, it means they're actually increasing the demand for money. Still raises your real interest rate, but look what it shows happening to the quantity of loanable funds, which is not accurate. I mean, yes, being taken out is more, but a good chunk of that is what the government took out and not what's available for everybody else. So this really wouldn't have like a label. We're just going to call it real. But this gap in here, this is the money that the government borrowed, which means this is what's actually now available for the public. And it brings you closer to what happens here. So again, you can graph it either way. I prefer this. You can choose either. Again, I keep saying you can graph it, but you can explain it either way. All right, hopefully that makes sense with loanable funds. I know you might be like, but we're not supposed to graph. But if you know what happens in the graph, you know what to describe. And this is where having those graphing sheets next to you can help you, just because you can look at them and then explain what's going on as long as you understand the question. Now, would I prefer you just know it off the top of your head? Yeah, definitely. But if you don't, that's why having those sheets nearby is helpful.